Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show today. Today, we got something really interesting to talk about. Vampires. Vampires, yes, real, true, blood-sucking, blood-drinking vampires. Welcome to Creative Visions TV. I'm your host, Karen Dahlman. Now, I've invited back a guest we had on recently. Her name is Rosemary Ellen Guiley, an incredible researcher, best-selling author, 66 books. She's written an encyclopedia about vampires and werewolves. She has a book out called Vampires Among Us, and she's going to be our guest today again because she talked originally to us about Black Mirror Scrying and got into some really cool divination stuff. And if you missed that show, be sure to catch it, link below. And at the end of this video, I'll have a link to it so you can go right to it and watch it. But today, it's all about vampires because Rosemary has done a lot of research. And I'm going to tell you what, she's not only researched this through history, she's interviewed live, living, the undead, I guess, vampires in person through various interviews she's done over the years. And so I'm so excited to bring her back on. I also want to say the only thing I really know about vampires is what I saw in the movies or read in books. We know Bram Stoker, talking about Count Dracula. I love Anne Rice's trilogy. I loved the movies she did. What was it called? The Interview with the Vampire. And of course, we know the Twilight series that was on TV. That's all I know about vampires. Are they real? We're not just talking about people that pretend to be or want to be, but are they real? And those people that want to be, do they become real vampires? So, without further ado, let's welcome back Rosemary Ellen Guiley to the show. Welcome, Rosemary. So glad to have you
Karen.
again. Hi. Thank you for joining us. This will be a great talk.
One of my favorite topics.
I thought so. So let's just start out with how did you get into the topic of vampires and also researching them?
I was 12 years old when I read Dracula, and I was hooked from then on. I was absolutely riveted by the idea that people under certain circumstances could become undead, leave the grave, and prey upon the living. And not only did I start reading other books, I started watching all the vampire movies, I started researching the folklore. This has been lifelong research for me, and I've done several books on vampires. The encyclopedia, Vampires Among Us, which is now out in a revised edition, and the Complete Vampire Companion. And then I'm also working with Sebastiaan, Father Sebastiaan, who's probably the best known living vampire in the world. I'm working with him on his autobiography.
Would you mind showing us the covers of those books you just mentioned? I know you have two with you right now.
Yes, the Vampire Companion's out of print. So this one is still in print, the Encyclopedia of Vampires and Werewolves. And it's a beautiful book. It's done on enamel stock, and it has color, art, and photographs throughout. Some of the old stills, they're black and white, but we have a lot of color in the book. And I cover history, folklore, famous cases, famous authors, the old vampire, old beliefs, new beliefs, the evolution in literature and cinema. This is Vampires Among Us. Now, the first edition of this came out in 1991, and it was it still is a classic. It was my odyssey around America and England, interviewing not only experts and researchers, but also people who either thought they were vampires or who wanted to be vampires. And at that particular time, the vampire community was still very much in flux. People were looking to film and fiction for their models, and that's not the case anymore. The vampire subculture has evolved on its own. Film and fiction don't portray real vampirism very well, and by the time we get from Dracula to Twilight, Twilight is so far from vampires, they shouldn't even be called vampires.
I read somewhere, I don't know if this is true or not, that they were originally going to be fairies, but they switched to vampires to make it more, I don't know, sellable. I don't know if that's true or not, but I heard that once. Because to me, they are a little more fairy-like, and I mean that in a positive way. Angelic, I should say. Who doesn't want to be this good-looking person that runs around, and have these relationships and stuff. But let's talk about the vampires you interviewed. I know you went to England, spent some time there. You interviewed them here. Tell us some stories about these people you met who are vampires. or believe they are?
Well, it's been an interesting evolution. Now, people are attracted to vampires for a lot of reasons. And over the course of time, vampires, they've always had an allure. They've always had a glamour. And they evolved from being the horror, the evil, something that should be repulsed and shunned. They evolved through the 50s and 60s, largely through horror films, into more exotic creatures. Count Dracula becomes, with Christopher Lee especially, a very dynamic and exotic, and a ladies' man on top of it. And so there's always a sexual undercurrent with blood. Blood has an erotic component to it. And so the taking of blood has an erotic component to it. Well, in the 1970s, we had Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, and that was such a game changer. It just changed everything for vampires. So we have moved completely away from the evil vampire, something that crawls out of the grave that you shouldn't even want to be around, let alone try to emulate. We now have Mr. Rockstar, who lived an exotic life in France,
sexy,
and making his way in the world. And we have the self-reflective vampire. Now, the vampire in folklore, they weren't self-reflective. If they escaped the grave and started pestering people, it was kind of a demonic sort of predatory behavior. They didn't sit around and ponder their evil nature and, how they should conduct themselves. But Anne Rice introduces all those elements into the vampire, and from then on, it just really exploded. So when I was going around interviewing people, which was in the late 80s, I found a real mix. That people who wanted to be vampires were still looking largely to the models provided by film and fiction. That you could only be out at night, you had an aversion to garlic, to sunlight, you had to drink blood, you should sleep in a coffin, walk around in a cape. And some of those were kind of silly things. You should find somebody to turn you. Like all the vampires in Anne Rice's mythos get turned. And she wasn't the only one. I mean, there were others before that. And we have the folklore that if you're bitten by a vampire, you're going to become a vampire.
Right.
But it becomes a more ritualized, erotic thing, where the blood drinking is to the point of death, and then the victim gets infused with the blood of the vampire. So I was running into just a lot of different definitions of how people viewed themselves as vampires and why they thought they were vampires. One interesting thread, which still holds up in the vampire community today, is that many people thought they always were vampires. There was something different about them from childhood that set them apart, and for many people they had a taste for blood. However, blood drinking gets to be very problematic for some people because it has an emetic property to it. And so if you drink too much of it, it's going to make you throw up.
Yeah, I get sick. Right.
So, draining somebody of their blood, that's just not going to happen. But people were trying to emulate this lifestyle. And over the course of time, with the influence of Anne Rice and a subculture that was growing mostly in big cities around the world, in Europe and in London, LA, New York, people were defining themselves as vampires and coming together as communities. And how do we define ourselves? So they literally created their own mythologies, their own communities, their own house rules, so to speak. And how they define themselves as living vampires. Most of them are energy vampires.
Okay.
That is, they take energy from people, not blood. There are some who do both, and there are some who are blood drinkers. And I have interviewed real blood drinkers, not just people who feel they have to drink blood in order to call themselves a vampire, but people who have a real physical need for blood.
Where do they get this blood? I mean, where do you get your blood? Where do they get it from a butcher shop? I mean, do they go raid a blood bank? I mean, where do you get your blood?
Well, animal blood will make people sick as well. So
I would think so.
But today, most of the blood drinkers have willing donors, and they know just how much they can take from someone without causing them, to have some health problems, or they think they do. And how much they consume varies by the individual. It might be like a pinprick on the finger and suck that for a bit. It might be a thimbleful of blood. It could be part of a wine glass full of blood. It depends on the individual. And it's not something that has to be done every day. It's done periodically to keep the energy refreshed. So there are people who are lone practitioners.
Okay.
And people who've banded together in communities. They've got their own mythology books. They're tracing their roots back to ancient times, to ancient gods who seem to be very vampiric in nature, and defining themselves as members of a community that are different from the Muggles, the everyday people.
Oh, that's what they call them. Okay, it's great. So it's a subculture that started. These are vampires that you interviewed, but where's the element of being interdimensional or being undead? Is that an aspect some of these people have spoken about to you? Or even, I always believe that vampires turned into vampire bats. Do they talk about their connection to any of that?
Well, in folklore, you have to be dead to be a vampire. How inconvenient for vampires today. Because they're not. They're very much living. Okay. So that's been a redefinition. Now, our ancestors, and up until, say, the 1600s in remote parts of Europe, the vampire was someone who was afflicted who died. They died. Reasons could be anything. They died of the plague. They died in sin. They committed suicide. Whatever made them unholy. And if they were not buried properly, they were at risk for returning from the grave and pestering people. Beliefs are very strong that people didn't just automatically go to the afterlife right away, that there was kind of this liminal zone where the earth spirit could linger around for a while, and that's when people were in danger of becoming vampires. So how would they pester people?
Yeah, good question.
What do people want more than food?
Blood?
Sex.
Oh, sex.
Sex.
Okay, that's probably true.
So in Victorian times, you couldn't have sexual overtly sexual predators. It was implied, but it was never overt. So the vampire was sexually dysfunctional, and the erotic component went through the blood. But in earlier times, it was a lot different. These vampires came and jumped into bed with people, and it was usually family members that so-and-so would come back and start pestering the wife or the husband or other family members. It would be an incubus, succubus kind of thing, sexual predatory encounters. There would be poltergeist phenomena in the house. People might see the specter of the vampire. These things could happen during the day as well as night. But there was a lot of body of folklore around vampires, like how they could be destroyed, how they could be contained. Right. And what Stoker did so brilliantly in the publication of Dracula in 1897 was he distilled folk beliefs that then became fact in the world of vampires. And he made some of them up. Vampires turning into bats? Forget it. That is a Stoker invention.
Oh, darn it. That's one of my favorite ones, though. Dang it.
Well, in Eastern Europe, there are no bats in Eastern Europe. So what's a vampire going to change into? He's going to change into a donkey, a cow, a dog,
a goat,
a wolf. But vampire donkeys just don't really cut it. And Stoker took the fear of the bat because the bat is airborne and
it's flighty. It's all over the place. Unpredictable.
We have tremendous fear of bats. And he also used the wolf to a lesser extent. And so he gave that kind of shape-shifting ability. And there were other fictions as well, that the vampire would be immortal until it was destroyed. Well, there's so many beliefs about vampires. Some of them are, the vampire would only exist for a certain period of time, and then its battery would run out, and that would be the end of it. Mutilating the corpse in the grave was another way to try and take care of the vampire. holy crosses.
Yep.
That was an invention of the church. The pagans didn't use those. The pagans had their own methods. Vampire cult, the vampire cult existed long before Christianity started to penetrate these remote areas in Eastern Europe. And when the church came along, they had a hard time dealing with the vampire cult because they didn't want people digging up graves. This should be forbidden. It was okay for the church to dig people up and see if they're saints, but you should not dig up the graves of dead people to see if they're decomposed. But the church advocated that the cross and the symbols of the church were the only way that you could vanquish
holy
evil.
Water.
So that got grafted onto the vampire cult.
Okay.
Vampires casting no reflections in mirror. Thank you, Stoker. Another invention.
Oh gosh, and see I'm tarnished. That's my belief in vampires, and I have a fascination with them because I don't fully understand it. But what I'm hearing you say today is that it's truly what it's become, what it is today, what it always has been, is some type of cult or underground movement of a subculture of people who just want to express themselves in a unique way. Which is different than the typical way that most people don't go about drinking blood. So is it to scare people away? Is it really for their own sustenance? What draws somebody to the vampire movement is what I'm trying to ask.
There are so many reasons, but the core of it is the vampire represents some sort of transcendence of death.
Okay.
Even for a temporary period. That you might have a horrible, unholy state of existence, but you are not dead. And so there's that appeal, which Anne Rice was very good at translating into this immortality.
Yeah, right.
You could have, immortality. Oh, yes, vampires burning up in sunlight. That's another fiction. Not a Stoker fiction, by the way, but a German film that plagiarized his novel, changed the ending. Trying not to be a plagiarism of the novel. That was Nosferatu. And so they had the vampire dying by the rays of the sun. And so this then becomes incorporated into film and fiction, that exposure to sunlight will cause vampires to burst into flames. And those beliefs did not exist in earlier times.
But people that are in the vampire movement, they tend to, like you said, maybe go out at night, maybe keep their house darkened with shades, or what during the day, wear glasses. Is that what they do to keep that alive?
Well, I would say there's less of that today than there was a couple of decades ago, because when I was out interviewing people in the 80s for this first edition of the book, people felt that vampires had to be nocturnal.
Yeah.
And so you were a night person, not a day person, and you had heavy drapes over your windows because you could not be exposed to sunlight. And you should have pale skin, so you were anemic. And, things like that were all these attributes of fiction and not so much related to the actual folklore. Well, today's person in the vampire community functions both in the daytime and the nighttime.
Okay.
And as Father Sebastiaan puts it, he said, we have a day side and we have a night side.
I love that. Well, how would you know if you met a vampire? How would you know if that person, would they tell you, or is it more of a secretive thing if they are practicing vampirism?
It's more of a secretive thing. Okay. Now, here again, when I interviewed people, some of them felt that they had to have a getup. They had to have a Count Dracula getup. They had to put capes on.
Okay, that's a giveaway.
And then do whiteface on, that sort of thing, and have garish, hairdos and
kind of like gothic
whatnot.
Looking, maybe.
Exaggerated goth,
okay.
And there are a lot of vampires in goth. There's a big crossover there, but on the average, you could meet someone who's a practicing vampire and not know it. Every person has his or her unique way of practicing. Some of them prefer to be private, like solitaries, and others like to be part of a community. If they take energy from people, some of them prefer crowds. They'll go to a place where they're are lots of people, like a sports game or a mall, where the collective human energy is, kind of bubbly and gyrating and in a big place. And they'll just take a little off that, whatever they need. And others prefer to have a relationship with a donor. It is considered to be unethical in most vampire communities to take energy from someone without their permission.
Because the old movies didn't show it that way. They just, the vampire comes in the window, goes to this beautiful lady laying in bed, puts his teeth in, takes the blood, and she might die or become a vampire herself, right? So there was no asking. So now there definitely is this reciprocity, I guess, an understanding that they're going to be a donor. So if you become a donor, that means you give blood. Does that mean that now you're inducted or initiated into the whole vampire community? Are you now a vampire?
Well, you do have a role in the community, and there are different terms for some of these donors. Black Swan is one of them. And you would be, I don't know if surrogate is the right word, probably not, but you would have that kind of relationship with the vampire where you would be providing. Now, there are some vampires who mutually provide that to each other. And then some of them have rituals. They have their own secret rites, just like the Masons do and occult orders. Sebastiaan has developed a lot of those rituals for what he calls the Sabretooth Clan. That's what he has developed.
I think I saw that. Yeah, very interesting, very fascinating. Wow. So, okay, boy, I have so many questions to ask, and I'm sure my audience will too. So put the questions below. Maybe Rosemary will come back and answer the ones I forget to ask. But, okay, so I'm trying to understand maybe the psychic or spiritual aspect of this too, the supernatural aspect of this. Are these people, you said they take energy, so they have a way to draw in people's energy and use that. Tell us a little bit more about this process, maybe of that, but also what their supernatural aspect is. Because I'm thinking vampires are able to, I guess I'm going back to the movies again, but they have some magical powers. So maybe speak to that.
Yes. Well, Stoker, of course, gave them magical powers. One was hypnosis, that the look of the vampire was mesmerizing. Another was supernormal strength.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would call it teleportation or bilocation, but, rapid movement, shape-shifting, certainly. And so individual vampires pursue some of these activities to their own taste.
Okay.
I've interviewed people who say that they are shapeshifters, but it's not a case of a human body turning into an animal or a bat or whatever. It's done on an energetic astral sort of thing, so that your consciousness is absorbed into another form, which then becomes tangible. And I know that sounds very strange, but these are occult practices that have existed around the world since ancient times. The ability to put your consciousness into basically a thought form that then takes on tangibility.
Well, the indigenous cultures did that all the time, Rosemary. I mean, the shamans who journey and the Aboriginals. So so they're practicing some of those old practices that have been around forever, it sounds like.
Well, some of them are.
Okay.
And, some of them don't have any interest in shape-shifting. There are different levels of the vampire community. There's the LARPers, people who are primarily interested in live-action role play. There are the lifestylers. They kind of like to dress the look, the vampire goth look, and go to the parties and the balls and dip into it a little, but they're not really fully living life as a vampire. And then you have people in the true underground who, depending upon how they define themselves and what else they're involved in, organize their private life around a lot of activities that many Muggle people, ordinary people, would find quite bizarre.
This is very fascinating that there is this culture. I thought it was all pretend. I didn't know. What did I know? And these are people that are saying this is how I choose to live right now. And do you find that when they enter into this kind of subculture or community that they stay with it for a long time? Is it more they just do it for a period of years? Like,
Varies.
we go in and out of trying things in our life, different sports, different activities. But it's more than that, isn't it?
It is. Vampirism attracts a lot of alienated young people, and that's understandable because alienated young people are looking for identity.
Sure.
And some of them are drawn to the dark, exotic side of that, and so they experiment with it for a while, and then maybe they move on to something else. And other people have been in the community quite for a long time. It's been very difficult to pin down exact numbers. There have been attempts to do census taking and population estimates. They range anywhere in terms of how many vampires are there, just in America, for example. It ranges from a few thousand to tens of thousands, depending upon the source you read.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to do that study and find out what people answer, for real, what they really tell you, and how do you know to get those people into the study themselves if they're underground? So it could be a lot of secret, right? People that are practicing vampirism. Is vampirism the right word to use?
Vampirism is, yes.
Okay, I thought I just coined a new word. I don't know. So I want to know. I still feel like there's got to be also people out there. I mean, boy, I believe in a lot of things, and I believe in interdimensional beings and all kinds of, different levels of consciousness, sentient beings that are in different dimensions. So are there these beings that are also vampiric existing in other dimensions that you may know of or research or come across?
Yes, in fact, sometimes I find the more interesting vampires to be in the non-human variety.
Oh.
And they are all over the world. Every mythology, culture, folklore has its own versions of vampire beings that usually take on hideous shapes, usually prey upon people at night, and do things like eat entrails, eat brains, drink blood. In other words, the vital essence of people. One of the more fascinating vampires from South America in the Andes, it's called the Pishtaco, and it's a fat vampire. It takes your body fat. Doesn't, who cares about blood? Takes your body fat.
Like liposuction?
Well, I'm sure if people find out about that, there'll be a lot of people wishing for the Pishtaco to make visit. But, think about this, Karen. If you are a community high up in the Andes, and these beliefs come out of Peru and Ecuador primarily, if you don't have body fat on you, you're not going to make it through the winter.
That's true.
You're not going to make it very well at all. So this is how the vampire gets you. It takes what you need to survive. In earlier times, and I'm talking centuries ago, throughout the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, the vampire took whatever would make you miserable. It would take the luck out of your life. It would take the beauty off your face, the honey from your beehive, the milk from your cows. It would blight your crops. It didn't just drink your blood. It blighted your life in some important way.
It took your sustenance, it sounds like, whatever it was that you needed to survive.
Exactly. That's the vampire in the broadest possible definition. So our culture, thanks to film and fiction and blood-drinking vampires, we've got a very narrow view of vampires. Beliefs are very interwoven. There's conflicting folklore all over the place. There's a lot of overlap between the vampire, the nightmare hag, the incubus, the succubus, and the poltergeist. And in the old vampire attacks, all of these things could come into play. They were all characteristics of the vampire.
This is fascinating because we're talking about, it's kind of like two types we talked about. The ones who are practicing the lifestyle of vampire and that are human like ourselves. And then there's also this whole aspect of these, I'm just going to call them interdimensional or a different dimension type of being. So maybe Bram Stoker wasn't that far off when he described some of these characteristics. Maybe he was talking more about this other being that was not human.
Well, Stoker did research Romanian folklore about the undead. He was fascinated by it, and he never went to Romania. He'd been to Switzerland. That was the closest he got. But he did do research from a few sources that were available at the time, and then he did what any self-respecting fiction writer would do. He just made stuff up.
Sure.
And it turned out to be a darn good yarn, because Dracula it's never been out of print since 1897. And the only other books that you can say that for since their publication are Pilgrim's Progress and the Bible.
Interesting, but I will say this about Dracula. We have Count Chocula, right? You even have the serial. So, I mean, the influence of what he did really has, crept into many areas of our life. We want to romanticize them and also demonize them, don't we?
Well, we do, and it's a constant tension. And I think that's what keeps us fascinated with the vampire. And yes, the vampire has become integrated so deeply into our pop culture. It's an iconographic sort of image. And vampire has graced just about every product and toy you can think of. It's amazing. And there's no end to it. I think Stoker would be astounded today. When Dracula came out, it was a modest success. Now, Stoker was not considered to be a first-class writer in his day, and it was considered to be a modest success. And I think he would be absolutely flabbergasted today at the vampire industry that churns along all the time without any signs of ever dying.
Well, that's the undead
immortality.
right there. They're proving that they are the undead. At least this movement is, because it continues on and on. Absolutely, a very interesting topic to talk about. Anything else you can share with us about this topic that might blow our minds that we haven't heard yet before? Since you've spoken to these people and you've done a lot of research on this.
Well, I'll just share what I'm working on with Father Sebastiaan.
Oh, great.
And we actually started our conversations for collaboration almost 2 years ago. Now, he's a very busy guy. He does vampire balls all over the world, and he has an apartment in Paris. And it took us a while to hammer out, what exactly we should do. But he's got an autobiography that he wants to weave into what he calls vampire world history. And this is quite an undertaking, because it goes back to ancient times, and it talks about the whole evolution of vampires in folklore, film, and fiction, the emergence of the community today, and then what is the meaning of vampirism today? And I think that's where the energy is going to land, toward the end of the book, is how do we make sense of vampires today? Are they really part of society, even though they're on the fringe? And how should we regard them? And Father Sebastiaan has developed quite a body of folklore and rituals and handbooks. I just did the introduction to one of his most important handbooks called The Black Veils, which is coming out, and I did the introduction for that. So this is a considerable undertaking that no one has ever done. Now, this was a massive undertaking, and it took me several years to do this.
Oh, I can only imagine.
There have been other vampire encyclopedias. Gordon Melton has done one. There's a few other people who have done vampire encyclopedias of varying lengths. And, I can tell you that anything that's comprehensive, that tries to tie all these things together, it's a considerable undertaking.
Oh,
so I've been spending time with Sebastiaan, my little digital recorder there, getting the notes down. I've got a lot of people to interview. I've got travel to do. And so it's going to be an exciting project.
Oh, I wish you much success with that. And definitely, I can't wait till that book comes out, so I'll be into that. And you know what? I know he has a YouTube channel, so I will put his link below. All of you that are listening to this and are interested, because this guy is a real vampire. In Rosemary, I guess you've worked with him quite often in the past doing his shows, haven't you?
I've done several shows for his YouTube channel. He is in the Encyclopedia of Vampires and Werewolves, so you can read about him there. And so we've had a lot of interaction over the years.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think a final question I have to ask you. Do any of us out here who are not vampires, do we have anything to worry about a vampire, creeping into our life and sucking our blood or hurting us? And I mean that with all seriousness, because I still get into this interdimensional beings and I think about them as well. I'm not talking not just the human, but also those that might be in another dimension. Do any of us have anything to fear with this?
Well, from the living vampire community, no. Okay. I'm sure that every now and then you're going to run into some manipulative renegade who likes to try his powers out to see how much he can manipulate people. And I have run into cases like that. But by and large, they want to stick to themselves and do their own thing. The biggest hazard would be running into a non-human vampiric entity. And that could happen if you get the wrong kind of attachment. You're in an area where these things are attached to the land. And they have an opportunity to assault you. People are not going to be assaulted just for no reason. Okay. We're not going to go to bed tonight and have an attack, for example, unless there's some mitigating reason for that. And so, whenever I'm called into these cases, when people say, I've got some sort of dark presence here in my house, I'm being attacked, I'm being pestered, I have to go back and look for the point of origin. How did something start? What happened? And for some people, it's just simply moving onto the wrong piece of property.
Yeah, that happens. And then at that point, I know you've done a lot of work with hauntings and stuff. Would you treat it a very similar way as you would a haunting?
It depends on how somebody is being affected. If an attachment is forming, that is, an entity has singled somebody out and is forming an energetic attachment to it, that's going to call for a different kind of remedy. You're starting to look at exorcisms there. And that's different from cleansing a property, for example.
Very interesting. Gosh, anything else that you need to tell our audience about the subject that I didn't ask? I mean, this is all, like I said to you guys, this is something that's more new for me to learn about the fact and fiction behind this phenomena. Is there anything else that we should have you tell us?
Well, I recommend that if you're at all interested in vampires, Vampires Among Us, the revised edition, which I updated to include the living vampire community. I left everything else the same because it's classic history. It freezes vampirism at a period in time that was formative. And that's a very interesting read. The encyclopedia I would urge people to take a look at because the folklore of vampires is so incredible, so varied, so fascinating that it's absolutely amazing. So a book like that is going to give you a good introduction to the topic. And, if you're like me, you'll be reading the novels and watching the films.
Exactly. It's absorbing it, taking it in. Well, where can everybody find you, Rosemary? And are you doing any workshops or lectures on the topic of vampires coming up that you can tell us about as well?
I don't have anything scheduled on vampires yet, but I'm often asked to talk about them, so something may happen for next year. It'll be on my calendar at visionaryliving.com, which is my website.
Links below, you guys.
You can sign up for my newsletter there as well.
Yeah, check out our website. Check out her newsletter. I'm a member of her newsletter. I get it every month. You get to see and hear. She has pictures and stuff, and she does an article, and she tells you where she's been, what she's exploring, who she's talking to. You get to live vicariously through her travels. And boy, does this lady travel, let me tell you that. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on our show for the second time. Really appreciate your time, and I wish you best with the book you're working on. This encyclopedia book, it sounds like huge undertaking with Sebastiaan too. So thank you again for being on the show, Rosemary.
And thank you, Karen. Very stimulating conversation with you all the time, and I look forward to our next get-together.
Yay, me too. So thank you again. Well, there you have it, everybody. We were talking about vampires today by a researcher and a person who's also experienced vampires in person, interviewed them, talked to them, learned about their vampire lifestyle. Yet she also goes back and looks into the history, a rich history of vampirism that comes from many different cultures. And as she mentioned, there's one vampire that can suck the fat out of you. Just kidding. We probably can't go that far. But anyway, it's fascinating to learn about the history of vampires and other such energies that are out there. So this was Creative Visions TV. I'm your host, Karen Dahlman. Now get out there and go explore. And I'll see you again real soon. Thank you.